You've mentioned that there's been a shift, and that's what you're describing, from strategic patience to active deterrence in terms of military strategy. How has Iran's military strategy evolved over the past decade, and why did it choose this moment to directly target Israeli infrastructure?
Yeah, Iran's long-term strategy militarily in terms of use or non-use of its military abilities was based on this, as you termed, strategic patience. Now, that was because it understood over the last couple of decades that Israel's
Mhm.
interest was to provoke Iran into some kind of a military response that would then allow the United States to join Israel in attacking Iran, mostly for regime change purposes, which is what I think the intention of Israel is. And Iran understood that it doesn't want to respond in any kind of irrational way from its perspective that allows the Israelis to get the United States to join them to attack Iran. So for decades, Iran tolerated a lot of assassination of its scientists inside Iran, a lot of attacks by Israel, for instance, in Syria, where Iran's assets were deployed to Syrian country. In that situation, that's now different. But Iran tolerated that and did not make any kind of response
Mhm.
until the last year when Iran's embassy in Syria was attacked. And Iran, in the post October 7 era, once attacked in this way, decided to respond. And that's why you had the first Iran's response, the promise number one response, that Iran actually portrayed its own ability or demonstrated its own ability to reach Israel, but
Mhm.
deliberately didn't use its more modern
Mhm.
missiles and deliberately didn't target sites that it could target. And it hoped that by demonstrating its ability, it would induce the other side to think that Iran has a deterrent ability. Mhm. But unfortunately, that didn't last long. And so Iran was forced into the situation to have another response in the number two honest promise that it named its operation. And it showed in that second attack that it can have greater ability to destroy targets in Israel and target them. And so we had that, but that didn't end the situation again. So we ended up with the last 12 days of war, which Iran was finally put in a position to show its hands in terms of its military abilities. And if you ask me, like, did the last 12 days demonstrate a deterrent standard for
Mhm.
Iran? Did Iran establish a deterrent standard going forward? I would say no. But at the same time, to be fair, Iran did show that under very, very strained situations, because if you remember the first day of the last 12 days of the war, Iran was surprised under the attack and within the first few hours lost the top senior officials of the military, a bunch of other top scientists, nuclear scientists. And from inside Iran, we now know that Israel had penetrated inside Iran. Huge gaps in Iran's intelligence, maybe department, have to be now remedied, because for months Israel was able to actually have clandestine sites of production, even of drones, for instance, small drones that were able to use in the first day of attack against Iran to target sites, military sites, launchers, etc. So from this perspective, Iran showed some gaps, but at the same time, when Iran used its missile technologies, I think it showed that its missile technologies, which are native constructions and production of Iran, it's a success. And to this moment, probably Iran didn't reveal all of its missile hands, thinking that violations of ceasefire will take place in the future, and Iran wants to, like, phase by phase move in that direction. So there's a good thing about the missiles, the native missiles for Iran, but I don't think it established a deterrent standard. And I would expect in the future Israel continue to violate and possibly challenge Iran further into moving in that direction.
Sanctions have been central to U.S. policy towards Iran, not only economically but socially and politically. How do you respond to claims that sanctions are a non-violent way to promote political change, and what are the real effects inside Iran of the sanctions?
Yeah, I would disagree, of course. To me,
Yeah.
sanctions are essentially economic strangulation of a targeted country.
Yeah.
And it's, it's against international law as well. And it's a non-humane aspect of U.S. policy. Something like 34, I think, countries are under sanctions by the United States. Maybe if in terms of population numbers and size, probably about a third of the population of the world is under the policies of economic strangulation or economic warfare
Hmm.
by the United States. And clearly it has terrible effects on the targeted population
Hmm.
in wherever the United States has targeted
Hmm.
these populations. For instance, in Venezuela, I think
Yeah.
the even data shows like maybe 100,000 Venezuelans have died as a result of economic warfare that the United States has waged against them. Fortunately, in Iran, I don't think the scale of deaths are
Yeah.
as proportionate to the size of the population is not as bad as in the case of Venezuela. That's because maybe Iran is a much bigger country and much more powerful and has other countervailing factors involved in it. But that doesn't mean Iran itself wasn't and hasn't been subjected to an imposed economic cost on its development with sanctions. You could make good case of probably about maybe 20% additional cost in almost every economic activity that Iran engages in
Hmm.
transactionally as a result of these sanctions policies. And of course, Iran's access to global markets is also restrained.
Yeah.
But nevertheless, it hasn't stopped Iran, for instance, in developing its own native missile technology with lots of effort and investment. But it doesn't have to be this way, of course. So, yeah, sanctions to me are criminal just as much
Yeah.
as wars are. And it's just a different form of warfare.
You pointed out that Iranian opposition figures in the diaspora, particularly in the US, aligned with imperial interests under the guise of regime change. How do you distinguish principled opposition to Iran's internal repression from opportunistic calls for Western intervention?
Yeah, just to be more clear about this, not all Iranian expats fall into that
Hmm.
category. But for
Hmm.
instance, right now, in the past 12 days, Reza Pahlavi, the
Yeah.
son of the former king, seems to be probably the biggest loser of the last 12 days. If you're thinking about like the individuals who were associated with this 12 days of war, I think he's the biggest loser because he just came out in the middle of the attack against Iran and took a position essentially in favor of the attack on Iran and then called the Iranians to rise up. And none of that happened, of course. Iranians went the opposite direction. They unified and defended their country and saw him as someone who apparently doesn't even have the sense of understanding that by siding with a war against Iran, he is going to repeat what we've seen, for instance, from Iranian Mujahideen group, what's called the MEK, back in the 80s when they sided with Saddam Hussein in the latter years of Iran-Iraq war and attacked Iran and therefore lost all legitimacy in the eyes of most Iranians because you don't side with the country that's attacking your country, regardless of your grievances at home internal to Iran's politics. So, now to the other part of your question, how do I distinguish between those who act like Reza Pahlavi, for instance, did in the past 12 days, and those who might take a different position? Well, it's a simple thing. I mean, I can understand that many Iranians have grievances internal to Iran's politics. And what we need to have, of course, is clarity about what those grievances are, but never allowing your grievances with Iran's government to be used and manipulated by foreign powers who obviously have different objectives with Iran.
Hmm.
So,
Yeah.
and historically, Iran's enemy, of course, historically has been imperialism, goes back all the way to the early 1950s when Iran's first attempt at parliamentary democracy in relation to sovereignty over its own national resources, quote unquote, oil, was toppled by the MI6 and CIA, and that's Mohammad Mossadegh's, 1951-53 parliamentary governing system of Iran, and replaced by restoration of an increasingly autocratic king for the next 25 years. And of course, after the revolution, you had the same issues with Euro-American imperial postures
Hmm.
vis-a-vis Iran in the Iran-Iraq war. Mostly they sided with the Iraqis. Beyond that, this continuous economic warfare against Iran with sanctions and all that. So anyone in Iran who takes their legitimate grievances with government, but allows these foreign governments, United States, and then, of course, Israel, to manipulate them
Hmm.
into siding with attacks against Iran, whether they're in the form of hot war or in the form of, let's say, economic warfare, or in the form of other versions of subversion, let's say killing people and assassinating people, destabilizing the regime. I think that should be the red line.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I would just say that, yeah, it's okay to have grievances about the government. And of course, the
Hmm.
government would have to address them, respond to them. But that's one thing. And siding with people who are attacking Iran is.
Revisit the question of the Iran's relationship or solidarity with Palestine. I feel that in a lot of your posts, you're making more of a tactical point. You're making more than a tactical point. You're making a moral one. Why does Palestine continue to shape Iran's international posture despite the costs?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I may have a different answer than if you ask a government official, for instance, or a
Yeah, of
state
course.
official. I think to take their point of view first, one of the, let's say, principal pillars of the revolutionary struggles that led to the downfall of the last dynasty in Iran, Pahlavi dynasty, and established the Islamic Republic soon thereafter, was solidarity with Palestine. So from the beginning, both the secular left in Iran in the 70s and then the religious left in Iran had Palestine in their eyesight as a
Hmm.
central, let's say, concern. And so it's not surprising that the post-revolutionary state in Iran has continued that perspective. Now, there's other dimensions. There are other dimensions to this. For one, maybe one important dimension is that also the post-revolutionary state in Iran saw its solidarity with Palestine as a way of endearing itself to the Arab world, to the Arab street. Because, of course, Palestine is an Arab question as well. The
Hmm.
Palestinian question is an Arab question. And as you know, Iranians are Persians mostly, and they're not Arab, but because of their solidarity with Palestine, that's one way that Iran can actually enter the consciousness of the so-called Arab masses, especially when the Arab leaders themselves are reactionary and either, I guess, give lip service to Palestine question, or behind the doors are actually collaborating with American imperialism and Zionism. So in light of the deficiency or the betrayal of the Arab leaders, and in light of the fact that Iran is not an Arab state, this issue of Palestine allows the post-revolutionary state to endear itself in the
Hmm.
region that it belongs to large masses of people, and not just limit itself and its revolutionary project to the Iranian, geography.